This is Colin Trudeau, and I'm here to present this course called Don't Get Trapped Without a Plan. This presentation is part of NADCA's ASCS Continuing Education Program. By watching this presentation, you will be able to get 2 hours of credit towards your NADCA ASCS Continuing Education credit. That is required to renew your certification. Don't forget to sign the affidavit upon completion of this course and submit it directly to me so you can receive credit. Now, before we go any further, NADCA has a disclaimer that I need to read to you. First off, this presentation is not intended to be a comprehensive program covering all aspects of this topic. All participants are encouraged to read and follow applicable standards, codes, and regulations related to this topic. The views and opinions following are the presenter's opinions and not necessarily the official position of the National Air Duct Cleaners Association. In this presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about how OSHA works. We're going to talk about the definition of confined space. We're going to talk a little bit about what is permit required confined space. And then also, what do you do if you get in a situation while you're in a confined space? So how does OSHA work? First off, we have to understand the general duty clause associated with OSHA. OSHA's general duty clause essentially says employers are required to provide their employees with a place of employment that is free from recognizable hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious harm to employees. OSHA wants you to operate in the safest way possible. It is acceptable to deviate from these guidelines if the alternative method is safer, but it requires documentation of how and why you have to deviate from what OSHA says you should be doing. Now, before we go much further, there are a few important things we need to understand about OSHA. First off, OSHA does state that training needs to be specific to the employee's job and the potential hazards that they may face. Now, some states, but not all states, require you to have an OSHA 10 or an OSHA 30, depending on the work that you are performing. And this will vary from state to state, and some states will actually have their own regulations. Like, for example, California has Cal OSHA, which has a little bit of variation as far as the requirements associated with their training. Now, one of the important things we have to establish as a company is who is going to be the competent person on a particular job or for a particular task. Now, this person is determined by the employer as one who possesses the skills, the knowledge, the experience, and judgment to perform assigned tasks or activities satisfactorily. So OSHA's rules and regulations are already confusing enough as it is, but what makes it even more confusing is OSHA actually has two sets of regulations regarding confined space. You have 1910-146 for general industry, and you have 1926-1200, which is confined spaces in construction. Now, both of these standards are very similar, but there are some key differences that will be discussed a little bit later on in this course. Now, we'll tell you this, 1926-1200, the construction part, is actually more current and more restrictive standard. So if we follow the construction standard, we'll actually be covered over the general industry standard, and that's what we're going to primarily put our focus on today. So before we go any further, we need to stop and talk about what exactly is confined space. Well, OSHA determines a confined space as any area that has limited means of entry and or exit. It's large enough for a worker to enter, and it's not intended for regular continuous occupancy. Examples of this would be including working in sewers, pits, crawl spaces, attics, boilers, ductworks, and many more other areas as well. So the next thing we need to define is what is limited means of entry and or exit. Essentially, what OSHA defines this as is a space that has a limited or restricted means of exit if a person could not readily escape from a space in emergency. Any of the following factors indicate that a workspace has a limited or restricted means of exit. First off, the need to use a ladder or movable stairs or stairs that are narrow or twisted. Second, a door that is difficult to open or a doorway that is too small to exit while walking upright. Third, obstructions such as pipes, conduit, ducts, or materials that a worker would need to crawl over or under, or squeeze around. The need to travel a long distance to a point of safety. So let's talk about continuous occupancy. So according to OSHA, and we're talking about confined space, continuous occupancy is referring to a space that is not designed for continuous employee occupancy if it does not have features such as ventilation, lighting, sufficient room to work and move around that is needed for people to normally occupy a space. This picture here of a crawl space or a work area, this, as you can tell, is not specifically designed to be in this area for long periods of time. As you can see in this picture, this is actually some sort of storage tank or holding tank that this person had to come into and actually had to use a ladder in order to access it. This would be considered a confined space. And in this situation, this is a hole that, as you can tell, it has movable stairs, or in this case a ladder, that is the only way to get in and out of. So this would be considered a confined space as well. Now this is a picture of some ductwork, which is a little bit more common to what we deal with when it comes to HVAC cleaning in confined space. And as you can see, and as most of you guys know already, there's not an easy way into this ductwork, nor is there an easy way out in case of emergency.
We typically don't think of HVAC units or air handlers as confined space, but if you think about the definition of what a confined space actually is, it truly should be considered a confined space. Now, you can make it a non-confined space by simply having a second form of egress from the unit. A lot of these units have doors on both sides, so simply by opening a door on both sides, therefore would eliminate the need of it to be considered a confined space. But you still need to follow the same protocols you normally would.
So we've talked about confined space, but what is a permanent required confined space? The distinction between the two is very important that you understand what the standards required for a permitted confined space and a normal confined space. A permitted confined space or permitted space is confined space that contains or has the potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere, contains a material that has the potential for engulfing an entrant, has an internal configuration such that an entrant could be trapped or asphyxiated by inwardly converging walls or by a floor which slopes downward and tapers to a smaller cross-section, or it contains any other recognized serious safety or health hazard. Employers must evaluate all confined spaces to determine whether they are permanent confined spaces. But regardless of whether it's permitted or not, safety measures must be taken in order to protect their workers regardless of what type of space that is. So we're not always lucky enough to have a sign that specifically states that a space is a permit required confined space. So you need to be on the lookout. If you see this, then obviously you need to follow the guidelines associated with permit required confined space. But also, if you're going to be on a project for a long period of time and you're going to have people coming in and out, it's also a good idea to go ahead and label it so that you can make sure everybody's following the guidelines and following the regulations that are associated with working in these environments.
Over the next few slides, we're going to take a closer look at what type of hazards you should be on the lookout for. But before we do, we need to make sure we have a clear definition of when we're talking about hazards, what we're referring to. So a hazard is anything that could impair the entrant's ability to escape unaided or could cause harm or death. Now, one of OSHA's letters of intent, it specifically says a hazard is any recognized safety or health hazard could include biological hazards such as molds, mildews, and spores frequently found in dark, damp spaces that can irritate the respiratory system. Bacteria and viruses found in sewage treatment exposes the entrant to a variety of illnesses as well. In addition, any rodents, snakes, spiders, and any other insects or even birds or animals would be considered a hazard as well.
So some common hazards that we need to be aware of when we're looking at confined space is what are the atmospheric conditions like? Does it have enough O2, have enough oxygen, or is the environment too enriched with oxygen that can cause a hazard? Does it have CO or carbon monoxide? Does it have H2S, which is hydrogen sulfide? NH3 would be considered ammonia levels that are higher than should be. And then the big question is, what is the LEL, or lower explosive limit, which is defined as the lowest concentration of gas or vapor that is capable of producing a flash of fire in the presence of an ignition source. Meaning if you had an arc or a flame or had excessive heat, could something literally ignite? And you need to know what those chemicals are or what those potential gases are to make sure you have a safe environment. Mechanical items could include things that could crush you or cause mixing. Stored energy, maybe it's not locked out properly. Processing materials could include steam, sewage, or glycol. And of course, you have the option or the potential of engulfment. Are you in an area that if it were to start to rain or something were to happen, that you could be engulfed with water or some type of grain, or even potentially the sides were to collapse and soil were to come in and engulf you in that area? Now, these are some other common hazards that we need to be on the lookout for, and they can be electrical, dealing with arc flashes or energized parts that could potentially electrocute you or shock you. What about chemical exposure? What type of toxic fumes or other type of corrosive materials or chemicals could be in the environment? We need to take into account the environmental exposure. Are you working in an area like in an attic that could be too hot to be working in for long periods of time and we need to take frequent breaks? Or even too cold, depending on the area that you're working in. And finally, we need to look at the flammables and combustibles. Do you have methane, hydrogen? What other type of gases or fumes could be building up in this area that you know about or maybe not even know about, which is why sometimes we have to use special devices in order to detect these. So once you've identified what the hazards are, OSHA has a hierarchy of hazard control. And the very first thing you should try to do would be to try to eliminate or completely remove the hazard. The example of this would be, to move the work from a high elevated area to a ground level so that you can completely eliminate the possibility that somebody would fall. The other option would be the next level down in the hierarchy of controls would be a substitution. Replace the hazard with a non-hazard. Example would be purging a fuel line and replace it with inert gas. Engineering controls does not necessarily eliminate the hazard, but it isolates it from the worker. Lockout tagout is a perfect example of engineering controls that de-energizes devices so you don't have to worry about being electrocuted, shocked, or other type of stored energy. Now, the fourth option would be administrative controls, controlling how people go about doing their tasks. This could include training, procedures. This could include scheduling, when you actually do stuff when most of the occupants would be out of the facility. And the very last thing we want to be doing is PPE. Now, PPE is very important, but it should not be your first line of defense. This should be your last line of defense after you've looked at elimination, substitution, engineering controls, and administrative controls. Then you can go to PPE, whether it be wearing Tyvek suits or respirators or welders' helmets as an example on this slide. So when you're dealing with permitted confined spaces, you do have the option to actually reclassify the space as a non-permitted confined space. Now, in order to do that, you need to document and have the competent person needs to go through these options here to make sure that they have removed all the potential hazards. This includes that you have documented the space does not have actual or potential atmospheric hazards. All actual or potential hazards are eliminated or isolated without making entry into the space. Inspection and testing is performed during entry to demonstrate that the hazards are isolated from the space. And the basis for reclassification is documented with the date, the location, and signature of the person making that determination. Now, real important for you to understand that forced air ventilation does not constitute an elimination or isolation of atmospheric hazards. So before we go any further, I need to identify some important acronyms. First one being IDLH, which is immediate danger to life or health. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. If you have a situation that's been determined IDLH, do not enter it. The next one we want to discuss is PEL, permissible exposure limit. This is the maximum limit set by OSHA that workers can be exposed to a substance. ppm, or parts per million, is another way that OSHA uses to actually measure what that PEL is. So OSHA's PEL for hydrogen sulfide is 10 ppm, which is only 0.001%. So hydrogen sulfide at 50 to 100 ppm will lead to eye damage. If the levels are 300 parts per million or 0.03%, that is actually lethal at that point. So let's talk about what the ideal atmospheric conditions are. So we monitor the atmosphere in a confined space by looking for the right balance. Earlier on the last slide, we mentioned that oxygen is measured in percentages. So oxygen, O2, should be between 19.5 to 23.5%. Anything less than that is not enough oxygen. Anything above that is too much oxygen in a workspace. Carbon monoxide needs to be under 50 parts per million. Hydrogen sulfide needs to be under 20 parts per million. And the lower explosive limit, LEL, needs to be under 10%. Ammonia needs to be under 50 parts per million. And this is common in power generation and food processing industries, which is why we need to keep an eye out when we're working those type of environments. Other than oxygen, you want all other readings to be zero when we utilize a monitoring device in order to obtain this. So what is air? Obviously, air is very important anytime you're working in a confined space. You want to make sure you have enough of it, otherwise it can create problems. So the air we breathe is made up of lots of other things besides just oxygen. Oxygen actually makes up about 20.8% of the air that we breathe on a normal basis. 78.1% of the air you breathe is made up of nitrogen. The remaining amount split between argon, carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapor are also typically in the environment as well. So let's take a look at carbon monoxide versus carbon dioxide. Now, carbon monoxide are byproducts of burning fossil fuels. They are poisonous at very low levels. OSHA's PEL for carbon monoxide is 35 parts per million. Versus carbon dioxide, which basically is gas exhaled while we're doing our normal breathing. Now, this is only poisonous at very high levels. OSHA's PEL for carbon dioxide is actually 10,000 parts per million. Now, it's very important that we understand the job site roles when we're talking about confined space. The host employer is the owner of the site. The controlling contractor would be the GC or the construction manager who is hired by the host employer to perform a specific scope of work. Now, subcontractors are hired by the controlling contractor to perform the aspects of the overall work. Now, typically, we very rarely will be the host employer. Often, we will be hired as the controlling contractor, and we may be the subcontractor, or we may hire subs to perform the work as well. Regardless if we're the controlling contractor or the subcontractor, we need to be involved with confined space and specifically with permit confined spaces. So when you're dealing with confined space, the first person you have to identify is the supervisor. The supervisor owns the hole. He is completely responsible for that hole, and he is the one who gets to say who gets to go in. He is the one that gets to fill out and signs all the paperwork, including the permit. He assigns each individual's entrance roles and determines what the emergency procedures are going to be. And it is possible, depending on the situation, that he can also be the entrant. Now, the attendant is a role that I see that sometimes gets overlooked, or it's a role that sometimes people just don't pay attention or give the attention that role truly requires. So the attendant keeps the attendance. He or she are the ones that make sure they keep track of how many people go in, how many people come out. The thing that is key is that attendant needs to maintain communication at all times with the entrant. They need to be able to have a way of communicating and make sure they know that everything is okay inside of the confined space. They monitor and record the air monitoring readings. If it's dictated, especially if it's permitted space, they will make those readings. Does not allow anyone that's not approved to enter the space, and summons emergency services if it is needed. The attendant cannot enter the confined space, and the attendant cannot leave the entrance unattended. They have to stay at the entrance and stay in constant communication at all times with those that are inside of the confined space. So the entrant actually is only allowed to enter the area when they are told to do so. They again have the responsibility to communicate with the attendant that anything that changes in the space, or to make sure that everything is okay throughout the entire process while they're working in there. They are required to wear the appropriate PPE as determined by the job hazard analysis, and they understand the rescue procedures. They need to understand how to perform them, as well as they need to understand what they are, so they make sure that they do not put themselves in a situation that the rescue procedures that are established are not going to be effective. So one thing that I hear confusion on is when we start talking about permits, people start thinking of dealing with cities and dealing with other municipalities. When we're talking about entry permits for confined space, we're talking about documentation of the situation. And that part of that documentation is to make sure that you have all your bases covered before you actually enter a permitted confined space. It's going to identify the location, the scope of work, what you're supposed to be doing, any potential hazards, controls that are being put in place, whatever the appropriate PPE, and who are the entrants that are going to be going into this particular space. So before you can even start work, one thing you need to do is you actually need to take some air reading samples. You need to identify what the oxygen levels are. You need to identify what the lower explosive limits are as well. Make sure there's no hazardous gases that are in the area working. You need to assign the different roles that are in place. What are your emergency procedures? Make sure everybody is on the same page as far as the procedures, as well as what the plan is if somebody gets stuck or something catastrophic happens. All the entrants need to be logged as far as when they go in, when they come out, the log readings, and the permit must be retained by the employer for at least 1 year after the work is done, so that we can make sure that if something comes up, that we can go back and reference all parties and all conditions that were involved. One of the things that the entry permit actually helps you with is identifying what PPE or personal protective equipment you're going to need for the given situation or scope of work that you're performing. Are you going to need a hard hat, gloves, eye protection? Do you need any type of fall protection or hearing protection? Do you have a concern about arc flashes? And if so, do you have to wear any type of special protective equipment for arc flashes or even for steam or burn protection? And what type of respirators are required? What is going to be your fit factor that you need in order to make sure that you have appropriate protection from the elements? And do you need supplied air when you're going into these spaces? So we talked about earlier the difference between construction and general industry when it comes to permitted confined space. This is one of the key differences between the two different regulations. So closing versus suspending the permit. In 1910, 146, which is general industry regulations, the permit must be closed at the end of a shift and a new permit issued for the next entry. Now, this pretty much primarily pertains to any time you're doing something that needs to be maintenance for the most part, something that has to be done on a regular basis. So if you're going in there every day or once a week or things of that nature, that's why they want you to close it down. Now, if this is something that's kind of a one-time deal or doesn't happen very often, and it falls underneath the construction guidelines, or it's maybe it's at the beginning of a construction project, the permit can actually be left open, and it can just be suspended in between entries, between shifts essentially, and you don't have to reissue the permit every time you do it. But in order for this to happen, the space must be fully reassessed prior to the next entry, meaning you need to verify that the oxygen levels, the PELs, and everything else are acceptable ranges. So let's touch base on the entry procedures. So things that you need to look at before you actually go in is what type of ventilation are you going to have in that space? Is it going to need to be continuous? One of the things that I'm always concerned about when we're cleaning ductwork, especially smaller ductwork and we're crawling it, is do we have adequate oxygen? One thing we want to make sure is we have some type of oxygen airflow going through that ductwork so that we make sure that we're constantly pouring stuff in and our employees are not suffering from carbon dioxide poisoning. What type of communication methods are you going to have in place? How are you going to ensure that you have constant communication with that employee that's in, or how is the attendant going to have constant communication with the entrant that is actually inside the confined space? The air monitoring, depending on the area that you're working and how you're actually accessing it and doing
performing the work inside of that confined space, you typically need to monitor at the beginning, and you typically need to monitor it periodically throughout the time that you're in there working to make sure that the atmospheric areas don't change. And you need to make sure that you are checking it in the areas that it matters. Checking it at the entrance when somebody's got to walk 30 yards or crawl a long ways does not ensure that you have the same level of atmospheric conditions at the entrance as you do in the actual area that they're working. And what about the big what if? So if there is emergency, who's going to do what? And how are you going to actually get that person out of that ductwork or out of that confined space? You need to make sure you have a game plan and what you're going to do if that does occur. So when we're talking about emergency rescue plan, we need to make sure we have procedures and have a plan in place that we can make a rescue. Now, that can be potentially calling 911, but we want to make sure that's not our only option. We want to make sure that we have people or support staff around that if something happens, that we can go in and make the rescue. But it is also important that we don't allow just anybody into that space. It needs to be an authorized personnel that's going into a confined space, and the reason for that is you don't want somebody rushing into an atmospheric condition that could be harmful to them, and now you're rescuing 3 people instead of only 2 people. An employer must designate rescue and emergency services that must evaluate the rescue team or services related to the capability to reach a victim within a time frame that is appropriate for the hazard that you're dealing with, that they are equipped and proficient in performing the needed rescue services. They need to agree to notify the employer immediately in the event that a rescue service becomes unavailable. And you really need to practice these services at least once a year, every 12 months, to make sure that you're proficient at doing it, making a rescue, and that there aren't any questions in case something were to come up, that you can immediately save somebody's life or prevent further damage or more harm to that individual. Now, one thing I could never get a straight answer out of anybody with OSHA on is what is considered a timely matter. Now, one settlement with the American Petroleum Institute, OSHA explains that a timely matter must be determined by the employer's reasonable judgment, and that's specifically related to the potential hazard the worker could be exposed to. Not a real clear definition, but essentially we need to do something that's reasonable and make sure we have an adequate game plan in place in case something does happen. So 2 options that you have when you're dealing with rescues is 1, to perform a self-rescue or even a non-entry rescue. These are the safest options that you have. Self-rescue is the ability to exit under your own power. The question you have to ask yourself is, how far is it to safety? And what obstructions may be in the way if you had to make an exit? Now, a non-entry rescue is the ability for others to actually physically extract the victim without entering the space. The question is, what equipment do you have? Do you have a tripod system like in this picture here where you have somebody on a tether and you literally can crank them out or use some type of winch and pull them out? What training do you have to use this equipment? Is the victim or the entrant going to be obstructed, and are you going to be able to physically use this equipment? And then the question also, can you even provide first aid to them? And then the third option you have, is, of course, is a third-party rescue or a 911 rescue. So the question is, a third-party rescue, do you have a team on standby ready to go? If you do, their response time is going to be much quicker than if you had to call 911 and bring somebody in. Now, the question you need to ask yourself is, that team, do they have the adequate training in order to specifically make this rescue? Well, here's the other thing. You call 911, depending on what you're doing, they may not have the adequate training to perform that either, which can then delay the rescue even then. So do you need highly specialized rescue equipment? And you need to understand the site of the site and the confined space configuration, understand the potential and realized hazards that are associated with a confined space. And you need to be able to relay that to the rescuers, whether that be a third party or 911, if you were to go down that route. So this acronym right here kind of summarizes everything. Failure. Failure is the failure to understand what the environment is, the additional medical issues not considered, inadequate rescue skills, L for lack of teamwork or training and experience. U for understanding the logistics of the incident. R for the rescue versus recovery mode not considered. And E for equipment not mastered. So again, this acronym failure kind of summarizes everything that we just talked about so far. So in conclusion, I hope this has given you a little bit more information and a little bit better understanding of what is considered confined space, as well as what is considered permitted confined space. So going forward, if you're asked to have a permit for confined space, hopefully you'll understand what needs to go into it. You'll understand the pre-planning that is essential for working in that type of environment, and also have a plan in place so you can perform a proper rescue. So this concludes the presentation at this time. I hope you guys don't have any immediate questions, because the way this thing's laid out, I'm not going to be able to answer them. However, if you do have questions, reach out to me. I'm happy to help. If you have a situation that requires a permitted confined space, I'm happy to help you out to make sure you have the training and the ability to perform those services. So now that you have completed this training, it's important that you sign your affidavit, and it's important that you make sure you get that back to me so that I can give you credit, so that I can get back with NADCA and make sure that you're able to renew your ASCS. Thank you for your time, and as always, if I can do anything at all to help you, do not hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you.